afternoon. So I will cover both in the round. So how many people in the room, show of hands, has either had a student loan or knows a relative or somebody? Yeah, a fair few. So part of what we do is an interesting debate, and we were just having it at the back of the room actually about what's the purpose of student loans, what's your feeling about student finance in the UK. But one thing that we have to contend with, if that's the right word, is we have 1.8 million calls from customers, mainly millennials or Generation Z customers that actually don't want to call us. And we have 5 million students in repayments, and we service 1.8 million loan applications a year. So the volume of the business is significant for a government agency. So part of our journey to things like digital and transformation, so we're on that journey just like a lot of you will be. We are progressively moving to cloud. We are looking at how we digitise the entire process. And in fact, if you apply for a postgraduate loan, it's pretty much predominantly now digital end-to-end. But we also clearly handle huge amounts of data. We are very significantly linked to other government departments, either for identity checking, for the flow of money out to either the student, if it's a maintenance part of the loan, or to the universities. So part of what we started to look at is, whilst a traditional technology transformation would fix the infrastructure, would fix the systems, what it clearly wasn't going to necessarily do is fix the sheer amount of moving of either data or in some cases still paper around the organisation. So part of what we started to talk about is, where do we spend our time? We've got a reasonably large call centre in Darlington that is about serving customers, as I said it before, who are essentially not wanting to ring us. They want to be able to do, like they can do on pretty much every part of the work of life, on their phone. They want to know their balance. They want to know where their application is. But also, the universities and the further education institutions also want to know where their money is, where students are. We need to know from further education institutes, are the students attending the courses, because clearly that's one of the contractual elements of getting a loan. We also need knowledge about people that are dropping out of courses, so that again we can amend our records. And also people that are changing courses, and that happens quite a lot. So all of that piece linked into what is, like a lot of people, a lot of legacy systems, doesn't help us get that volume and get that efficiency through. So we started off looking at the whole IA journey, so the intelligent automation journey. How did that apply to us? Gartner predicted in 2015 that the automation software market would hit 760 million. It's already above that. Robotic, any interaction on robotics is about to improve customer interaction, but it's also about us being able to service those loans faster. So one of the challenges of student loans is we have this enormous peak, which is also known as September. So all those loans start to build pretty much from now, but it reaches its peak, and the payment that goes out ready for the new financial year or the academic year is the biggest BACS payment in the UK. So we're trying to find ways of flattening that peak. We're trying to find ways of processing information on a much faster basis, so that the other challenge to our business is where a student has a different set of circumstances, and it could be anything, and it needs a human assessor to look at that case to make sure we make the right decision, to make sure we give the student the right support. We can't do that at the scale we need to do it if we're also doing that with the very straightforward cases. So we started talking, as I say, about this, looking at the whole RPA piece. Now, the first thing that I was met with by the board is, well, we can't really afford it this year. And there isn't anyone to do it really this year, and there's not really a contract we can use. And if I'd given up at that point, we would still be not doing it. So we deliberately started a sort of legitimate skunk works. So we top slice some availability in a commercial contract, took some teams out of my traditional IT teams. We made sure that we had the right wrap around it, but we did do this outside of the business machine. And we started, as you'd expect, with one pilot. That pilot was either to prove that we could do this in a way that would be beneficial, but as one of the key things on there is return on investment. And this is one of the key things I'll come on to about RPA that you've got to be very careful about, because you can spend a lot of money automating a process that may not pay back. So we started this skunkworks only in November last year. We've got a lot of interested parties from the business, so people wanted to be part of this. People could see the scale of operation. But if we start at the sort of 2 o'clock place, compliance. So firstly, well, the audit, well, hang on a minute, how are we going to audit this? So a traditional governance arrangement in government was trying to be applied. Will it improve delivery? Well, that wasn't clear in the pilot stage. The return on investment, clearly key. And are we going to eliminate repetition? Because that's what clearly in that first pilot piece we were trying to do. So we selected our candidate project, which was a piece of information that has to be collected from the universities and future education establishments. But what we then do is we batch that up, we check all the information's there. Once it's batched up, it's entered onto the system. Then there's a check on the system to make sure those things are there. Pretty labour intensive. Big team just processing that, just one piece of information. So as we went through that process, what was clear, and perhaps something we hadn't thought about, which I'd urge anyone getting on this journey to do, is what process are we trying to automate? Is it the process we have today that is the manual process, or is it a different process that would be more efficient to be an automated process? And the business really struggled with that, because people are used to doing things in a different way. And of course, what you end up doing is run the danger of making a bad process faster and automated. And then by doing that, you effectively lock in the past. So that was a big, painful journey in that just first pilot. Now, of course, as you move through and start doing more of them, you essentially end up sort of having to think differently, and then the business starts thinking differently. And when you get to the next candidate project, people have already thought, well, okay, maybe we can do this differently. So the customer experience piece, absolutely. So our customers aren't just students, as I say, they're also the institutions. Much faster return from that. Compliance, I literally did have to sit down with audit and say there is a different process here. You're going to have a different audit process for the improved delivery we'll come on to. Non-invasive, so that the other point is that because we're all doing big transformation programs, there is a danger, of course, if you do this on the side, things are moving on in the infrastructure and main system space, which ends up giving you a challenge. So being non-invasive into our core systems, and particularly the systems that are linked to the customer portal and the financial portal. Did it give process improvements? Did it reduce our cost? And what was the financial model? So I'll come on to that. So prioritise the best suited RPA cases. That's the first thing. What is the processes you want? So there's loads of things that people come out. You get a sea of requests. So you need to be really clearly ready for that piece about which one becomes a candidate process. And it's not like a lot of other routes to getting things on a project list. You've really got to make sure that this is part of the future. It's genuinely going to give you that return. It's genuinely going to help release agents. And the point I made earlier about we want our human agents doing more, articulate things. We want our human agents doing more complicated assessing, not some of this throughput. And let's be honest, a lot of our agents don't want to be doing the sort of in and out type work. Are we being realistic on ROI? So what's a good ROI for RPA? So the pilot cost as much as we saved. That was sort of okay because it was a pilot. But as we moved into the second robotic pilot, we then said, oh, hang on, this has got to start paying back. So the industry average on that is 5-to-1. So given that you could spend 500,000 on a RPA tool, that's quite a saving. So then we started to get into a bit of a conversation with the FD saying, if we can save that sort of money, can we then spend that money for the next robot? And the whole thing then starts to become self-financing. Not an easy conversation with a CFO, because spend to save is often seen very suspiciously. Well-defined governance structure. So governance in a very different way to the way perhaps we do normal projects, because the governance clearly can't stop the evolution of this. We had to think differently, but what we also had to do is make sure the usual suspects of data compliance, security, that were, by doing these things, we weren't breaking into that in a way that would be foolish. And then what RPA tools? There's loads out there, so which RPA tools you're going to use. So what we did was got a pilot license. Not a pilot license, but we basically just got a temporary license, as it was by UiPath. So the cost, again, in that pilot was very small in terms of it didn't work, then we could walk away, but it clearly did. Re-engineer the processes to maximise. So again, what that first process, do we really need it? Is it something we've just already done and we don't need to be doing going forward? So we made sure that was the case. And then, the usual one actually with IT, strong collaboration with the business. But as I said before, in a different way. Clearly, nobody had done this before. We had to be very careful how we tread, because of course the moment you talk about robots, people say, is that my job gone? Even on a pilot on the first day out of the block. So that needs some really all careful sort of managing through. And for me, and certainly for SLC, I think that it'll be some time before there's a human impact. At a certain tipping point, then clearly, new technologies come in, new jobs are created. But for now, there's so much sort of low-hanging fruit to go after. And I think that this is about our humans doing more meaningful work. So as I've said before, we delivered this through a skunk works. We've got some key people in our operations team, and we then ended up starting to roll the first pilot. So 187 case files took 60 minutes to process, whereas before it was nearly 420 minutes, and it produced a 90% accuracy. So the 10% was things it couldn't read or it couldn't actually decipher. What we hadn't realised is that 10% actually produced a secondary benefit, because when it spat out the ones it couldn't read, it also batched them. So when the human agent went to look at the ones that hadn't been able to do it, it was very clean and very batched, and we got another time saving from it. So from that, we were able to start proving that process. We're now on getting on for 6 RPAs. We think we've banked about £1 million of benefit already. We've got people moving into a very different space now in terms of the work they do. But of course, the challenge around doing RPAs, you've got to start thinking about it. So in our case, we can use robotics for pretty much anything. You can make them work. But if you've got a particularly sensitive case in a student loan application where it needs a human to make a decision about what the right thing to do is, there becomes an ethical piece there about how far do you take that. So most of our loans will go through pretty clearly and pretty fast, but there will be about 20% that really need some real careful understanding. And if we don't get that right, that could be a news story, that could be on the front page, etc. So the human bit of that, for me, is quite key. So this is where, how do you spread that out? How do you make sure that the things you're doing are the right things from a human point of view? RPA is not free, so that's one thing that some people do get. So you look at this process and it's all, you get 20, 30 robots instead of getting 20, 30 temps in, for example. But the licensing costs of ramping up the robotics for a particular process can be expensive, so managing that, managing how you do that. So other parts of government have stopped recruiting seasonal 200 people, seasonal workers, and deployed 200 robots. But that whole piece is very carefully managed, and you of course, you can turn them off. And that's another skill that we don't often utilise that often. You can't turn people off. You can't say, well, sorry, don't need you today, off you go, particularly if they're permanent. So that for us was part of that model. You've got to make sure that the RPA will pay back. The people suspicion, that isn't going to go away. And clearly in some industries, and we've heard a little bit about it today, where it's already taking rolls out the market. So how do you handle that? How do you make sure that you're not creating an environment where people think this RPA is just going to take my job away? Because, of course, what then that does is stops people getting involved. It stops people trying to help with the systems to build this. And they break all the time. That's part of what they do. So if you put an RPA into a system, you make a systems change that back-end system, or you transform that back-end system, then it breaks the robot. And so what you do need to do is build, we've called it the studio, others call it a garage, but what you do need to do is be ready to tweak the robots. Now the point is that you can tweak them really quite fast, 2-3 minutes you can get them back up, but you do need that whole front to back process from the business gateway, is it the right process, right through to is that robot going? Because the moment you bank that benefit, the moment you take those human people away and put them in other parts of the business, and then that robot doesn't do that job, you're suddenly in a bit of trouble. It's repeating the same point there, but if you don't pick the right candidates, you won't get the efficiency, and therefore, as a result, you're not going to drive that volume through the business. So for us, we've taken 6 months to get that right, if I'm really honest. So we dried up within 3 weeks of all these things that we needed to automate, but suddenly we couldn't find the right processes. Now, I think the WIP list is about 100 processes, because people are thinking differently about what they do, thinking about what could be automated, what shouldn't be automated. So that takes time. That's it's one of these things that it seems to be a solution for everything, but it's not. So to get the business side getting that right is really tricky, because, as I said before, they are fixed into the way we do things now. And then RPA being in a lean environment or an agile environment, that can cause problems too, particularly with the software development teams. Particularly if we're cutting across, going live with some of these robotic products can impact other parts of the business, other parts of the technology roadmap. So that's a lot of consideration. So we built a team very quickly to about 20 from one pilot. Now it's about how do we make that scalable? How do we start to make sure that we can not only put robots live almost every week through different Scrum teams in there. If it takes more than 4 weeks, it's probably not an RPA candidate, and I think that's the point, that you can bring things to market. So the big surprise in our call centre agents was, actually, what do you mean it's ready? Because they're used to waiting 3 months, whatever it was, particularly in the dark days. Whereas now it's there, we can prove it, and if it doesn't work, you can switch it off quickly, but it is about that investment. So one thing we recognise is we've spent 6 months talking about RPA and RPA this and RPA, and isn't it great? But clearly the whole intelligent automation suite becomes really open to us. So virtual agents for us, particularly for a lot of those calls about where's my application, when am I going to get paid, all that sort of stuff. So we've started a virtual agent program now as well to start looking at some of the more basic queries we get, which can sort of account for quite 25% of the volume. Natural language processing, so we also deal in Welsh. So that whole automatic transfer of some of that response for the Welsh language, but also some of that sort of what are people saying. So if it's a written letter, being able to read that text, take the key thing that the customer's saying. Image recognition, big for us, because the one thing that triggers a student loan is the national insurance number. So we have a little saying no knee, no loan. So again, people are having to read that, record it, enter it in the system. So the tools that we've now got around the recognition is reading those numbers, putting them into system, cross-matching with DWP, or if it's identity, cross-matching with the Home Office and Passport Office to actually do that verification that once took students to send a passport in or other forms of ID that frankly through in the world of GDPR you simply wouldn't want to be doing. And then machine learning, of course, so what is the pattern of our customers, what triggers those contacts that we clearly don't want to be taking from people that don't want to be calling us. How do we make it smooth? So one of the challenges that we face is we get one extract from HMRC annually, so this point about what's my balance, what can you tell me what I owe is quite tricky. It shouldn't be, but it is. We've started more frequent data sharing to start to resolve some of that. But we can see through all our touch points activity that causes customers to call us, or when customer does something that we have to then call them. So the machine learning stuff's just kicking off. It's a bit early days, but it is starting to point us to a very different way of thinking about how we service our customer base. So early days for us, as I say, we haven't got all the answers, but it's proved to me that in a fairly traditional IT business that we're now moving on to cloud and starting to break down our applications to be much more microservices based, this was seen as a bit of a distraction, whereas in fact this will probably deliver more benefit in year 1 and 2 than the actual bigger programs. The bigger programs will ultimately deliver us that core infrastructure, that core system. But in the meantime, with all those agents sat on a phone, potentially to a upset customer, this is going to give quite massive benefit now, whilst the transformation stuff takes a bit longer to deliver. So that's it. Any questions?
Who decides? So you're saying you get the wrong ones, so who decides you're getting the right ones? And have you got a set of criteria you can share?
Yes, I can. Yeah, my email's at the bottom there, so I can certainly, if you drop me a line. So that's an interesting question. Who owns RPA is another interesting question. Is it part of IT? Is it part of the business? So we created a forum that included somebody from the operational area that understood the process, somebody from the technology area which recognised how long it might take to put the RPA into life, and somebody from the financial area, because to create this spend to save model that the last robot pays for the next robot, there's 3 criteria in there that make up a sub-list of 6 that says, actually, is this process future process? So if we did transformation overnight, would that process still be there? That's the first thing. And even if it did, how long will it take for transformation to deliver that? The second point is, how much is it going to cost to mobilise that? Thirdly, is the data effectively clean enough for an RPA solution to drive through the right results? So I can certainly send that out. Hi.
You said you've got a number of bots now.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you use an orchestrator bot, or is it just a manual thing?
So at the moment it's a manual thing, but we are just creating a centre of excellence that will absolutely have orchestration in it. Because part of it at the moment is a set process, an RPA process, but what we want to get to is dormant robots, if that's the right term, ready to hit the peak. So we wouldn't run those licenses all year round, but as we start to get busy, certainly as we get closer to September, then we'll mobilise that, and that's where we need the orchestration. And the other thing is selling this to the board, because one thing I can tell you is doing an RPA presentation is incredibly dull in terms of watching the mouse move around the screen. You have to slow it down, which is kind of the point. But to get board members sort of hooked into what this does is, what I found the best way to do that is take an agent that was doing the manual process and talk, as we often hear, about the, where we are around, is it the business running IT or IT running the business? So we talk very much in what's it done for the business, what's it done for the customer base, why has it saved the time, why has it saved the money, and how do we just put this through our whole organisation, but with capturing those risks around there are some processes we would always want a human to understand. Anyone else?
Asking the second question on this, resources, building up that team, where did you traditionally get people from? You started out with IT, but did you branch out?
Yeah, I sort of raided my DevOps team to the annoyance of my head of DevOps. we went to the business analyst team as well, so we got 2 or 3 people that knew the operation much better at line level detail than we did. We also went to our customer panels and said, you know, what are the things that irritate you? And then when I say customer, again, it's that too. It's either students or financial institutions. But we also looked at where we get an efficiency. So if a financial institution or a student doesn't send us what we need when we need it, then we also looked at what was driving that. Firstly, we went to IT to really set up the infrastructure. We did it on premise initially, then moved it to the cloud. We then set the sort of front door to it, I suppose is the way you'd probably describe it, of having the business analyst going out into the business and hunting down these processes. And then in the first 3 or 4, we kept that team together, but as we've grown, we've started to split it. So you've got the people building and the people supporting now quite separate. So that, you know, we can make sure that we're getting the efficiency. That efficiency doesn't start to drag off for any reason. And as I said, when there's bigger system changes, we've got somebody there to fix it straight away. And some of it is as simple as repointing a server somewhere in the back end suddenly takes half the robots out.
Thanks for sharing today. Is there a database that you're pulling from the automation and what's it doing that you can use for kind of future iterations of more streamlined bots, or is there any kind of like, are you pulling data that you can reuse? And could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, data is clearly the big point for this. You know, the one of the challenges in all organisations is that data of the right quality to pull it. So we've got 3 ways into SLC. You've got the customer portal, you've got the FE portal. So that's where we're getting the data from, and that's where we're pulling data from that and doing a bit of a consistency check, cleaning that data up, and then pulling that into our sort of central repository that we can keep going back to that. Because what we don't want is those portals starting to get out of check with what's going on in robotics. So it's not separate, but it does go through a finer cleansing process so that, you know, when we get the result from the RPA, we can go back and do a sample check of the manual process to see if the answers are the same. And in the early days, they're not. You know, you think, well, hang on, how's that happened? And it's because there's a piece of data in there, or there's a flow from another system that wasn't taken into account. But it goes both ways. So we found that some of the human process was given the wrong answer as well. So it's about when do you jump in. So initially you're very cautious, you sort of bring it on very slowly, but as you get more comfort, as you know that data is becoming of better quality, and it just does, you know, it's not just for RPA. Once that data quality has been improved, we can start exposing more of that as a value chain to the front end. We can start showing more to our customers online. So you know, it's a tool that helps with both, really.
Did you involve any data scientists and maybe predictive analytics models in the process?
In a very minor way, only because we're not that advanced in that yet. So we've got an analytic team that started to look at trends again, so we could cross-match what the robotics were doing in terms of whether they're telling us the same trends. But data is one of the areas within the business that we need to do more work on, and I suspect as we grow in maturity that will be an important part of how this develops out. Okay. Oh, go on.
Sorry, I keep asking lots of
That's
questions.
right.
I might grab you at the end.
There's no quote for it.
Now that it's grown up to the size that it is it still an IT thing, or is it now business improvement? Is it who decides on this? Because it feels like you've grown something really big.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I'm passionate that it shouldn't be an IT thing, because, you know, there's a very distinction between what we do in the technology space to what this is trying to do for the operational space. But in a sort of weird sort of way, it can't also be a business thing, because you know, it goes back to that point about having the right candidate projects. So we've created a, you know, for want of a word, committee on this, that has a representation from all our business areas, has somebody from technology, has a finance interest, and it's a much smoother sign-off process, because the one danger is you start pulling in all the governance and all the routing you do for all the bigger programs, and then that just kills it dead instantly. So we've got a committee that runs it. Currently it's sat jointly between me and the ops director, partly because I drove this from the start, but at some point there are two operations director, one for pay and one for repay, and ultimately it needs to be owned collectively by them. And there will come a point where it either gets a little bit less, the payback starts to reduce, there aren't many candidates, and then you've got to start looking at the other areas and what they are. But initially I think it does need technology to just give it that first push. What we want to do is create a centre of excellence so that we can start sharing with other government departments, other private sector companies that are doing robotics, start sharing code. And we also want to produce an academy so that we can start producing our next generation RPA engineers, because the market's very tough, particularly where we operate in Glasgow. So eventually it becomes its own centre of excellence. As I say, we're calling it the studio, but you can call it workshops or garages, and nobody knows that.